Another fascinating effect that you could relate to the study of VR as an object is the so-called chameleon effect. This chameleon effect was first observed, and we know it very well, from real-world interactions outside of virtual reality. And here in this famous study, it was observed in an experiment in the lab. And this chameleon effect is really related to the link between perception and behavior. So when you're alive, you perceive the real world around you. You also perceive people in this real world around you. And what's apparently a characteristic of our behavior in the real world is that we often start behaving in the same way as the people that we see. So you can nicely test this for yourself. For instance, if you're sitting in a classroom at some point and you take on a certain posture, so you start sitting a bit like this, for instance, then at some point you will notice that half of the class will also sit like this without even realizing it. So apparently we have this tendency as humans to sort of behave, to sort of mimic other people that we see. And there are many examples of this. So one is posture, of course, but another one is smiling. If I start smiling, probably at some point you also start smiling. Perhaps even yawning can be considered also an example of sort of the way in which we are sort of chameleons in everyday life. This sort of basic fact was then exploited in this study by then looking at whether people regard, whether people value other people more if those start behaving more like themselves. And this is what they found. So if you're a participant in this study and you're interacting with someone else on a task, and that person starts behaving like you in their posture, for instance, or in the movements that they make, afterwards, if you test this, it turns out that participants like that person more compared to if that person is not mimicking them. So that's the chameleon effect. If people start mimicking us without us realizing it, we start liking those people more. Then the question is, of course, if this is such a solid and nicely observed effect that we can relate to the real world, to our behavior in the real world, as when we interact with other people, do we also see this in VR? When we're interacting with, for instance, virtual agents. And this was nicely studied in this article a bit later that introduced so-called digital chameleons. So here the idea is, again, you go to the lab as an experimental participant, you're interacting with a virtual agent, and without you realizing it, this virtual agent starts mimicking you. And in this case, the head movements of the participant were mimicked. So when you're interacting, of course, your head is moving in some way or in some other way. You don't even notice or realize this yourself, probably. And here, a virtual agent was then mimicking the head movements of the participant. So if a participant would move their head in some way, in this case, 4 seconds later, this virtual agent would make the same head movements. And then afterwards, those participants received the questionnaire. They received some questions, such as, how much did you like this virtual agent? And if this virtual agent was mimicking the participant without them realizing it, without them noticing it, they started liking those virtual agents more compared to when this virtual agent was just making random head movements. So this again sort of shows that we like, in this case, virtual agents or other people if they mimic us, probably because those virtual agents or people are then conceived as a bit more similar to ourselves. Apparently we like ourselves. So if we see something that we do ourselves in some other person, we like that. So this sort of also shows that people treat virtual agents, in any case in this study, in the way they also regard other people in the real world. So this is a nice basis, I think, for then also assuming that if you're studying something in the lab, in a virtual environment in which participants perhaps are having a certain interaction with a virtual agent, that if you reach any theoretical conclusions there in the lab, you can sort of safely assume that then those conclusions also generalize to real world behavior with real people. So that's nice. All right, so this is then actually very much an example of studying virtual reality as an object. How do we behave in virtual reality? Do we behave in the same way in virtual reality with virtual agents as how we typically behave in the real world with real people?